Thank you all for joining. We're going to wait a few seconds to make sure people have a time to join the event. Okay, I think we can get started. Thank you all for joining us today to hear insights on the war in Ukraine from people who are really plugged in to the policy thinking in Moscow and European capitals and in Washington. We have Andrey Kortunov, the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council and a crisis group trustee, joining from Moscow. We have Ambassador Gerard, a former French ambassador to Washington and the UN and a crisis group trustee who is in New York at the moment. And we have Olga, Oliker, the program director of Crisis Groups Europe and Central Asia program, who's joining from a different part of Brussels than where I am, her deputy in the program and a former Moscow-based journalist. So this call, I must tell you, is being recorded and live streamed on Crisis Group's YouTube channel. And after about a 30-minute discussion, we will open the floors to questions. So if you want to pop those into the Q&A, you're welcome to do so at any time, but we'll turn to them after a bit of debate. So the death and destruction of the war has been mounting by the day in Ukraine. More than 2 million people have fled the country in the fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II, according to the UN. Russian troops are advancing slowly, but it's ongoing, and it seems that reinforcements are being sent. Russian commanders appear to be resorting to increasingly brutal firepower. Meanwhile, we have tens of thousands of civilians who've been able to flee via humanitarian corridors for some Ukrainian cities, but in the southern city of Mariupol, escape routes have been blocked for days. So today, we had the highest level talks between the Russian and Ukrainian foreign minister in Ankara that ended without progress on negotiating a ceasefire. Meanwhile, Europe and the United States continue to seek ways to ratchet up sanctions and reduce imports of Russian oil and gas. And more companies are pulling business out of Russia. Moscow has warned the West that it was working on a broad response that would be swift and felt in Western capitals. So the picture is exceedingly grim, but we're going to try to focus on our discussion on what little room there is to help mitigate the suffering and bring a quicker end to the fighting. So with that, I want to turn right to Andrey to ask what promise or space you see, if any, in the ongoing negotiations for a ceasefire and potentially in the positions of both sides.
Thank you, Alissa. Let me start with saying that I was very cautiously optimistic about the conversation between the two foreign ministers in Turkey today. It seemed to me that over the last couple of days, the positions of the two sides were getting closer to each other. On the one hand, we heard from President Zelensky that Ukraine might consider alternative options for providing national security, not just the NATO accession for the country. And definitely that was an important step on the part of the Ukrainian leadership. I think it was a difficult decision, but nevertheless, it was made. On the Russian side, what we watched was that official spokespeople from the Kremlin dropped one of the earlier stressed goals of the military operation, specifically what they called denazification of Ukraine. And many of us interpret this change in the rhetoric coming from the Kremlin as a signal that probably regime change is no longer one of the goals of the military operation. So it seemed that there was a movement in the direction of some kind of an agreement, at least narrowing the gap in the two positions. However, today we saw no progress. There was no agreement on a ceasefire. We know that the Ukrainian side asked for a ceasefire for at least 24 hours, but this idea was not supported on the Russian side. I think that there are still issues with humanitarian corridors, despite the 3 rounds of negotiations in Belarus. There are still disagreements on the direction and specific escape routes for the civilian population. Today, I'm afraid I'm less optimistic than I was yesterday. But on the other hand, I think that maybe the will to fight is already losing steam, and that might create some initial preconditions for further negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrey. Gerard, I wonder if you might jump in on this with your thoughts of where things stand. I mean, less optimistic than before is not a good place to be, but is there room for international mediation? Is there room for anybody to help broker?
Thank you very much, Alissa. You know, any crisis has a momentum of its own. Any crisis of the importance and seriousness of the war that we are facing is going through different phases, you know, acceleration, sudden brutal acceleration, plateau, reverse back. And in a sense, as outsiders, we have also to take that into account. Right now, it's really, I should say, it's not the time for negotiation, because the Russians have invested so much in political and military terms that for the moment, they are not ready to accept any terms, but more or less the surrendering of the other side. Even if, as Andrey has said, they are really sending some dim signal. And on the Ukrainian side, they are also in a phase when the outrage of being attacked, the outrage of the civilian casualties, and also the excitement of the resistance, of the national resistance, is also, of course, not leading Ukraine to consider the terms that the Russians would be able to offer right now. So unfortunately, I think that we are going to leave a few weeks at least of fighting. In parallel, there will be talks, because this crisis has a particularity, which is that the people, each other, they know very well each other, they are neighbors, and so I'm convinced that in the coming weeks also we would have in different manners we would have talks between both sides. As I think, as Andrey said, I was reassured by the interview, which may have been overinterpreted, the interview of Zelensky, President Zelensky to ABC News, because it shows that the man is not only courageous, but he's also smart. He knows that he will have at some moment to negotiate. And so really he has shown some opening, maybe some overinterpretation, especially on the part about the Donbass republics or so-called republics, but nevertheless, it was also a positive signal. So what the international community may do, I think can do, and may do in the coming weeks, I think it's important to think in several terms. First, and one of my worries would be that the West, quote unquote, will transform this war into a West-Russia war, which means that Ukraine will become a sort of a stage of the rivalry, the confrontation between the West and Russia. I think it's very important that we let Ukrainians to decide by themselves their own fate. We shouldn't outbid the Ukrainians, you know, really. And that's question about the sanctions, you know, really. I'm worried that some countries could think, and maybe the public opinions in the West could think, that actually, even if there is an agreement between Ukraine and Russia, we should keep the sanctions. And of course, that's not, I guess, it's very unlikely that the Russians will accept any form of agreement with the Ukrainians with the sanctions. So I think it's important on the West also to say that the Ukrainians are on the front line, the Ukrainians are fighting, the Ukrainians are suffering, and that it's to them to decide what they should accept. We are in a supporting role. The second element, it means also that the negotiation can't be only between Ukrainians and Russians. There is also this Western elements, and we have to find the right articulation between what the West is doing. And I think that so far, I think President Biden, Chancellor Scholz, President Macron have been very good at keeping their cooperation with President Zelensky, and we should do it. And you have also the problem of all the other mediators. We had the Israeli Prime Minister. I think you heard at some moment in a very not strange way, but unexpected way, the High Representative, the EU High Representative, saying, "Oh, China should step in." President Macron and Chancellor Scholz were actually on a video with Xi Jinping. So it will be important also to keep, I think, a coordinated approach between all these mediators, because you can be sure that in the coming weeks, you have a lot of mediators or people trying to do it, which it could be positive, but it could be also complicating the efforts to reach an agreement. And final point, and I should have started by that, it will be a negotiated settlement, a negotiated outcome. And that's what we should try, the best that we should try to reach as quickly as possible. Ukraine is destroyed under our eyes, and neither side can win. The Russians, won't be able to crush the Ukrainian resistance, and the Ukrainians, really are not going to defeat the Russians, but in an insurgency which could last months and years, and which will be the destruction of Ukraine. So at the end of the day, it will be a compromise. And whatever we think of the Russian invasion, there will be a compromise in which there will be some elements towards Russia. So back to what I say, that will be to President Zelensky and to Ukraine to accept or not to accept the terms of a potential agreement. And we, the outsiders, we are in a supporting role in this endeavor. Thank you.
No, thank you. Those are all really good points. So we're looking at a situation where you think, both speakers think that the fighting will continue for a while. And of course, it will be some time before the sides arrive at a place where they're ready to negotiate that solution. So in that time, I want, Olga, do you have anything to add to that? But also, what are the risks of escalation?
So I agree that I think both Russia and Ukraine right now, they're fighting for the negotiating table, right? They believe that they can attain on the battlefield things that will put them in a better position to negotiate from. Nobody in their right minds thinks that the appropriate solution to this war can be solved with a full-fledged victory by one or the other side, Ukraine, because it would take a miracle well above the miracles we've already seen in the form of just how well the Ukrainians have turned out to fight and how poorly the Russians turned out to fight. The Russians, because their victory would mean occupying Ukraine and the lengthy insurgency that Gerard mentioned, which would be incredibly painful, costly, difficult for Russia for a very, very long time. So they're fighting for the negotiating table. I do think that we are going to see escalation within the conflict, and then the danger is escalation of the conflict. We've already seen Russia escalate. Moscow began this war with a fairly low-key approach that did look like it was trying to minimize civilian casualties, but it also relied on being greeted by a friendly population. Since they were not greeted by a friendly population, they ratcheted up, they escalated. And we have seen since attacks on a lot of civilian infrastructure, which of course results in civilian casualties. Now, I have to say, having watched Russia fight wars over the years, this is nowhere close to all that they can do in this sphere, right? They can do a whole lot more if they really let go and attack civilian areas. Now, again, if they think they're going to end up occupying this territory, that's a really stupid thing to do, right? Because they're going to have to rebuild. They're going to own it. If not, if they're trying to bring Ukraine to heel, there's a certain logic to it. And I think that's something we will all be watching for. The other escalation concern I have is, and Ambassador also mentioned that, is the escalation beyond Ukraine and Russia to a Russia-NATO conflict. And one of the things I worry about is that this could happen almost by accident, right? We have Western states supplying Ukraine with weaponry, and that has been crucial to Ukraine's capacity to hold back and slow the Russian advance. And I think it was very much the right thing to do. But you have a lot of calls now for a no-fly zone, which would imply NATO forces coming in to shoot down Russian aircraft and also to attack Russian air defenses on the ground in Russia so they can't shoot down the NATO aircraft that would be coming in to enforce that no-fly zone. That is war, right? That is NATO going into this war with Russia. I would say that this is thus far, no NATO leader has said that this is a good idea. In fact, the United States and the NATO Secretary General have been very clear that they don't want this sort of escalation. But as the war drags on, I think there's going to be more and more calls for this sort of thing. There will also be more and more calls for delivery of more advanced weapon systems, perhaps in ways that also engage NATO forces. If, for instance, you fly aircraft, even if it's Ukrainian pilots flying them, but they're flying from airfields that belong to Poland, then Moscow might see Polish targets as appropriate targets in this war. That is another way to backstep into a war between Russia and NATO. And again, thus far, I've very much seen NATO leaders be very, very careful about this. But I think, with the longer the war goes on, the more the pressure is going to build for a more active NATO role. I will say that I think Russia is also afraid of this sort of escalation. And a lot of the people who are arguing for a broader NATO role think that this could deter Russia and force Russia to back off, right? The fear of this kind of escalation, which of course in its absolute worst case could actually lead to a nuclear exchange, that should deter Russia. And it might, but I think the costs and the risks of it are such that it's not something that I, for one, am willing to commit to.
No, I think these are really good points to make, especially since we have seen a lot of discussion around the no-fly zone. It's an idea that that remains out there in a lot of the media and the discussions around Ukraine at the moment. I'm very glad to see Gerard is back with us. I want to turn straight to you if your camera's back on and working, because it seemed like there was something that you wanted to add to Olga's discussion. And I also wanted to ask, about the European response, particularly on the humanitarian front now, with the fighting ongoing, with so many people coming to Europe, how prepared and how much is this going to change Europe to a certain extent for the years to come?
Well, I hope I have 6 hours to answer to all these questions. Really, I will try not to waste them. I think, obviously, and I guess that it's one of the many mistakes that Putin has committed. The response, the European response, has been exceptional in the unity of the Europeans, which, frankly, are really considering the behavior, the special relationship with Russia that some member states like Hungary, but also Greece, for historical reasons, have to Russia. We shouldn't have expected such a unity, but also the strength of the response. I think that President Putin has not understood that the idea of classical war, you know, a state attacking another state in Europe in 2022 was a very traumatic event for the Europeans. Really, we have such a long history of wars leading to 2 world wars, which in a sense are part of, unfortunately, of our DNA, the European DNA, that this attack has created this very strong response. And especially everybody, of course, knows it, especially in Germany. And we have heard the speech by Chancellor Scholz about not only the military expenditures, but also the gas, about the gas. And apparently Chancellor Scholz is supported by the large majority of the Germans. And throughout Europe, you have the same feeling of outrage of the public opinion against Russia, with what we knew by experience, the fact that the far right, which is powerful in most of the European countries these days, this far right was pro-Putin and is trying to dissociate itself from the stigma now. And I say that, of course, especially as a Frenchman, because we are going to elect our new president in first round in 4 weeks only, and second round in 6 weeks. And we have, unfortunately, a very strong far right, which was very much aligned with Putin. And you see the candidates leaning to the far right, you know, really doing their utmost to dissociate themselves from Putin. So, and also general declarations which are leading into the direction of increasing the defense budgets. So it's quite a trauma. It's quite a shock. With it, I think it's too early to guess whether everything which has been announced will be decided. I think it will depend also on the length of the crisis, the length of the conflict. Obviously, if you know everything is solved, that we could pray in a few weeks, maybe the old habits will come back. But for the moment, the Europeans are, I should say, in a mobilization stage. The question of the refugees, of course, it is in human terms, of course, is a tragedy. And as you know, it's a particular problem because the Western societies, American and Europeans, are really facing a very strong anti-immigrant stance. And actually, in the French elections right now, immigration is one of the top topics of the political debate. I should say, I'm a bit ashamed to say it, but I think that everybody knows it. The fact that the Ukrainians are Christian and blondes is really, in a sense, playing to, I should say, to allay the fears of a part of the European population. I think, unfortunately, human being being human, the Ukrainians will be certainly greeted in a most positive way than the Afghans and the Syrians were. And I think that for the moment, we are in this stage where you have only in Europe a feeling of mercy, a feeling of towards these immigrants. I think the European Union is reacting very, very quickly. Yes, a lot of money has been allocated by the European Union. Yesterday, the Polish, French, and German interior ministers were on the borders with Ukraine to look at what is doing. France has announced today that it will take 100,000 immigrants, immediately Ukrainian immigrants, and the public is actually providing a lot of support, really accommodation and so on. So I think that for the moment, I won't be over optimistic. The public opinion in the West, in Europe, is still in the process of saying these people are suffering. We have to support them. And we have to support them because they are, quote unquote, like us, and also because it's the very beginning of the crisis. If we have 3, 4, 5 million of migrants, of course, the problem will be quite different. But again, for the moment, the reaction of the public opinion is more in terms of really trying to help than reacting with fear. Thank you.
I think Alissa seems to have frozen, so I'm going to jump in very quickly on the refugee issue and just add a couple of points on that while she regains connectivity. I think one thing that's really important to realize about this, this refugee flow is that it is incredibly gendered. The refugees are predominantly women, children, and the elderly because Ukraine is not letting men between the ages of 18 and 60 out of the country unless they are single fathers or the fathers of 3 children or more. So basically, Ukraine is operating on the assumption that we're going to let the children out. The female parent should go with the children unless there is no alternative but a male parent going with the children, or you need both parents because there are so many children. This means that the refugees that are entering Europe are not simply white and predominantly Christian, they're also female with kids and the elderly in tow. Now, that also means that you can bet that they're probably likely to go back home, right? Because you have the family separation, they're going to want to be reunited with their families. If the men continue to be unable to leave, the women will want to return. But it also does create these additional stresses of family separation, and it might lead to greater vulnerability of the refugees, particularly because they will all be single parent households. So somebody has to be able to work. That's, very difficult. They will be potentially seen as more vulnerable because they don't have male protection. So they might be preyed upon by various sorts of people who look to take advantage. So you have a very different set of risks for this refugee population than you do with other refugee populations. And I think that's something that the countries accepting the refugees will want to keep an eye on. Also, they'll want to keep an eye on the fact that you've got, for instance, queer Ukrainians who are going to countries like Poland and Hungary, which are not particularly queer friendly. We'll want to be thinking about how to protect people with those needs. And then, of course, Roma, people from the Roma community who may not have adequate documentation and may also face discrimination in some places. So it's really a fairly complicated refugee crisis. And thus far, countries bordering Ukraine really have stepped up and done an excellent job of welcoming people. But as time goes on, the problems will multiply.
Thank you, Oriane. I'm sorry for dropping off. I mean, it has been moving to see countries step up and people, welcome refugees at train stations and in other places. Of course, there is both I don't know if you touched on the situation of IDPs within Ukraine, that is also a big issue. I'd like to also turn to Moscow a bit and see what the view is there. I mean, we saw at the very beginning a sort of a shift in some popular protests and then a shift in reaction and quite stark laws being passed about how we talk about this conflict. So, Andrey, could you give us a sense of the mood and the thinking in Moscow? Yeah.
I think that the first reaction was confusion and shock. Because I don't think that many people in Moscow or elsewhere in Russia really anticipated what could happen. For most of Russians, any conflict between them and Ukrainians is inconceivable almost by definition. The first impact on the population was, of course, the drop of the price of ruble, which lost about 50% of its value within 1 week. That was pretty shocking as well, especially for those people who need to deal with hard currency, and there is a clear shortage of liquidity in Moscow these days. The second very clear change was that many of Western retailers and fast food outlets like McDonald's, Coca-Cola and others started leaving town. And you already see that there are more and more empty spaces that used to be occupied by retailers or by restaurants. However, this is something which has an impact primarily on the middle class and mostly on the urbanized youth. Of course, the impact on people living in smaller towns or in rural areas is not that visible. Moreover, sociological polls suggest that there is a rallying around the flag phenomenon in Russia. The popularity of President Putin went up, not down. We don't know how stable this support is, but nevertheless, it is there for the time being. Let me also add that, of course, Russia is used to live under sanctions. It is a more or less permanent phenomenon in the Russian life. So the officials try to convince the Russian population that it is still not really different from what we saw before. However, this is not exactly the case because this wave of sanctions is by far exceeds anything that Russia has gone through so far. And it is still not clear what implications on the Russian economy it might have. For instance, we don't know whether Russian air traffic, not to mention international air traffic, but even domestic air traffic, how it is going to cope with the new restrictions imposed on Russia, where Russian aircraft are able to get maintenance or spare parts, and whether the system is likely to continue operating at the current level. I think there are many uncertainties about what they call import substitution. For instance, they often argue that Russia has achieved a lot of successes in terms of agricultural products, and this is arguably right. But definitely even these successes are connected to Russia being integrated into a broader European agricultural industry, including agricultural machinery and seeds and some types of fertilizers. So I think that definitely the costs of the sanctions will build up gradually, and they will become more visible over time. And finally, let me also say that what bothers me personally is that it seems that for the first time, at least that I can remember, we can see that this resentment against the Russian political leadership, against the Russian decision, is becoming a resentment against the Russian society and the Russian people at large. So I don't like the term Russophobia, but I'm afraid that I have to use it when I watch developments in Europe and in the United States. And I think that if it is there to stay, that might be a very serious obstacle on the way of any future reconciliation that we might think of right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrey. I mean, I think that speaks also to Gerard's comment earlier about turning this into a West Russia conflict and the way in which people are perceiving the difference between the leadership and collective responsibility, as some would want to say, which is certainly not the case in this conflict. I'm going to turn to the Q&A portion of the discussion. I don't have that many questions, so I'll keep going with our discussion otherwise, but I do want to encourage everybody to state their name and affiliation when they put comments or questions in the question and answer. It's very helpful, and then I can share those. We have one that I would like to turn to Gerard, which is a very broad-ranging question, but I think it hits to the global ramifications of this conflict and the way in which it has been felt pretty far from, all the way to Latin America, and, in terms of the response in the UN. I wonder if you might speak to the global response to this conflict and how it's been different from what we've seen in the past, notably 2014, when we were at the beginning of this war.
Thank you. I think that that's typically the burden of the Frenchman, really talking about anything, really without any preparation. Fortunately, I went through the right school, so I'm very good at speaking of what I don't know. Of course, I can't make in 2 minutes such an answer, but I think there will be wide range consequences. I try to really maybe to give the item. First, I think NATO, and for coming from Paris, it's a sort of a bittersweet, really conclusion that there is a revival of NATO. Basically, our Putin has saved NATO, and when people are going to have, the ongoing debate, debate between the French and the rest of the world about European defense, I think that in the coming months and years, it will be a debate about European defense and NATO, how the Europeans can cooperate within NATO and with NATO. And I think that for the Americans, it means also that we will need some American creativity. Really, we have had some, with what was called the Berlin Plus agreements between NATO and the EU, but we will have to work on it. But NATO, I should say, NATO is back. Secondly, there will be a lot of questions which have already been raised about globalization. The economic crisis, really the COVID crisis has led to questioning about globalization. The populist wave in the West has led to questions about globalization, deindustrialization. I think that the sanctions which have been taken by the West, in a sense, is saying, really will obliged a lot of countries, for instance, China, but also Russia after the crisis, and really to some countries thinking that they don't want maybe to depend on a Western-dominated system. There will be also about energy, really realizing that depending on foreign energy has also a consequence on strategic autonomy. So there will be also this question. There will be also really a look at the American leadership. The Americans were tiptoeing out of Europe towards Asia when suddenly the Russians had the very bad idea of calling them back. What will it mean? What will be the question, the intensity and really the shape and of the American involvement in Europe in the future? I think that the Biden administration has well managed the crisis. There have been some bumps, but it's unavoidable. But has well managed the crisis. What will be the decision of the Biden administration after the crisis, and what happens in 2024 according to the result of the presidential election? And there will be also, being global, an assessment of what is the reaction of the rest of the world to this crisis. When I was ambassador to the United Nations, I was really struck by the way other countries were looking at the world in a very different way from the Western countries. And I remember fascinating conversations with African ambassadors, and about the double standard. For instance, really we are so excited by the invasion of Ukraine. Be assured that a lot of countries don't forget what happened in Iraq in 2003. And so there will be also, I should say, that the West shouldn't really, if at the end of the day it's a good outcome, the West, and right now, shouldn't think that everybody is behind us. Really, what is what is the assessment of the other parts of the world? The West, we are looking at the world in a very Western way, and we should try to have looking from elsewhere. Sorry to have been so
No, that's great. I'm going to bring Andrey in on this one, particularly to say, what has been Moscow's view of, if I may, Moscow's view of the global reaction, beyond obviously European and capitals and Washington, but the UN vote.
Well, I would agree with Gerard that it is mostly about whether the Western reaction becomes universal or not. And though, of course, the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly votes are very indicative, but still, I think President Putin might rely on his traditional strategic partners in the global South. And it's worth noting that in the UN Security Council, China and India abstained. They didn't support the Russian position, but they didn't join the West in its condemnation of Russia's action. And I think that this is what the Russian leadership is trying to capitalize on, saying that, okay, the West is against us, the West is united, but the West is no longer all the world. And by the way, the share of the West in the global economy and in the global politics is shrinking. So basically, we can live with that. And it's an open question because if you look at sanctions, many Chinese private companies have to abide by US sanctions, even if they do not like them, because no one wants to lose the US market. No one wants to lose the European market. So de facto, this coalition might turn out to be larger than it is currently anticipated in the Russian leadership. Whether this coalition is sustainable or not also remains an open question, and we don't have an answer. And of course, I would echo what Gerard has said. In Moscow, it is very popular to say that when Americans invaded Iraq, and it was arguably a false pretext that Saddam Hussein allegedly had chemical weapons. Nobody really, complained that much. Of course, there was a coalition of U.S. opponents, including Russia and France and Germany, but nobody thought of any sanctions against the United States. So, of course, in Moscow, they would say that you are using double standards, and that is yet another manifestation of the Western hypocrisy. But in the end of the day, let me say that a lot will depend on whether, this particular conflict becomes a kind of blimp on the radar screen, an aberration of the current developments, or it rather becomes a norm. Whether, we will see a similar crisis around Taiwan or maybe in other parts of the world, because if it becomes a norm, then I think that we are all in trouble, because that would mean that the global order, the way we knew it, is coming to its end.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to a more specific question about the ramifications for the region. We have two questions about Moldova. Olga, I wonder if you might step in and talk about, Moldova in particular, but also perhaps the way in which post-Soviet states or near neighbors of Russia are seeing this crisis.
Sure, thanks. So Moldova has really been a hero state per capita in taking refugees, some of whom are going on to Romania and other countries, but some of whom are staying. And for a country that is not wealthy, to say the least, and institutionally strapped itself, it's really quite a heavy lift that they've taken on. There have also been concerns, on the one hand, that if Russia is emboldened by this adventure, thinks it goes well, it will move on to Moldova, to Georgia, perhaps to the Baltic countries. I have to say, it would be hard, I think, to make an argument in Russia that this is going well, at least for somebody who has access to information about how the conflict is actually going. So I would think they would think twice, certainly about Moldova and Georgia, and absolutely about a NATO member state, which would, of course, create automatically NATO involvement in the war, right? It would be an attack on a NATO member state, and an attack on one is an attack on all. That's a war with NATO. But I think countries in the other post-Soviet countries, which are not Baltic, which are not members of NATO, have been trying to balance. On the one hand, I think the leaders of all of them, with the exception certainly of Belarus, are very supportive of Ukraine and would like to see Russian troops leave Ukraine. On the other, they are nervous about joining sanctions regimes. I mean, in the case of Moldova, its economy really couldn't survive without an economic relationship with Russia. So unless somebody figures out a way to solve that problem, it's not an expectation one can put on them. Georgia also, we've had massive protests in support of, massive demonstrations in support of Ukraine, but also a government that's been loath to join the sanctions regime. The other interesting aspect of this has been Russian pressure on members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, in principle, to join in the fight, which they have generally tried their very best to duck and avoid and try not to be put in that position. Even Belarus, from the territory of which we've seen attacks into Ukraine, we keep hearing stories about the fact that, about the idea that Belarus is going to send in troops, but that's also been quite a bit of foot dragging on it. Though, I think there is some evidence of some involvement by Belarus in the conflict. So I think the challenge for these countries is that they don't want to be next on any list that Moscow is putting together. They want to maintain their own security and their own sovereignty. But they would, they probably think the best way for that to happen will be for Russian troops to leave Ukraine. And they're just at a bit of a loss as to how they personally can support those goals, that goal.
I'm going to do a quick follow-up with you, Olga, on another questions, and then I'm going to group the ones that we have in the chat because there are quite a number now. Just to follow up, there are two questions that deal with attacks on humanitarian corridors and what can be done to mitigate that, and a concern about how long this crisis might drag out and the consequences, both humanitarian but also for food supplies more widely on that. So I don't know if you...
Tiny questions,
tiny questions, I know.
Questions. So sorry, the first question was?
Basically, how do you mitigate attacks on humanitarian corridors? How do you, yeah.
So right, if you negotiate a humanitarian corridor and then the people trying to use it to flee get fired upon, you're not going to get any more humanitarian corridors negotiated, right? How can you trust in any humanitarian ceasefires under those conditions? People won't use the corridors, people won't leave. You will get more civilian casualties because they'll stay in the line of fire. We have seen a little bit of progress on that front in Russia not firing on humanitarian corridors more recently, even though there was evidence of shelling of people fleeing through those corridors earlier. It's a war crime, right? If it's done intentionally, it is a war crime to fire on civilians under those conditions. There's not an awful lot else you can do except point that out and, potentially decide what you're going to do about it after the war is over. In terms of the long-term effects of this conflict continues, the humanitarian effects will be huge under pretty much any circumstances. The economic effects, food supplies, trade, markets, all of that will be huge and global. I don't really know what I can say other than yes.
No, I think the concern is about how long and protracted the conflict might be in following global trends. But
I hope not that long, right? I hope that the fact that everybody does see a negotiated settlement as the goal will mean that a negotiated settlement is possible. But here's the thing about war is that the first couple of days are always so horrible. You think there's no way this can continue. And, here we are now 2 weeks in that it's continued. There's a certain kind of acceptance that comes about as the fighting goes on and on and on. this could last for a very long time. It would be horrible. It would wreak tremendous damage upon Ukraine. It would, also wreak continuing tremendous damage on Russia. European security would move closer and closer to a Russia-West conflict over that time, which is extremely dangerous, as we've already discussed. And yes, the global economy will not be the same with the exclusion of Russia, with a war in Ukraine, with huge refugee flows through Europe. You can probably model aspects of this, right? You can make certain assumptions about how all of this works, but the bottom line of all of your models is this is going to be very, very bad.
Yeah. On that note, I want to turn back to Andrey, because we have a couple of questions about how far Moscow might want to go in this conflict, what kind of off-ramps there would be, questions around what kind of scenarios would be seen as a victory at this point by Putin. So I'm not going to go reading them all out, but the general sense is, how and what does Russia need to stop fighting at this point?
Let me start with saying that, in my view, one of the problems that we face here is that Putin cannot afford to lose this war for domestic political reasons. He has to bring something back home that would justify the decision that he made earlier. The question is how he can define victory, what is enough. My personal take is that the first goal, and probably the most important goal, is to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO and to prevent Ukraine from working with NATO. And this is something which is now considered by President Zelensky. At least it might be considered by the Ukrainian side. But this is clearly not the only goal that the Russian military operation has in Ukraine. They would like Ukraine to recognize independence of the two breakaway regions, Donetsk and Lugansk. I think it is extremely difficult for any Ukrainian leader to do that. But it is also now very difficult to imagine a situation when these breakaway regions are going to be reintegrated into the Ukrainian political, economic, and social space. It will definitely be very challenging. They used to talk about, as I mentioned, about denazification, but I think that now the perception is that it's better to deal with Zelensky than with any alternative to Zelensky, because if there is no legitimate government in Kiev, if the country falls apart, Russia will have to face another Afghanistan of a larger scale, and this insurgency, this guerrilla warfare can go on, and there'll be no end to violence. So my personal take is that right now maybe the major stumbling block is Donbass. How this issue will be addressed in future? Are we going to resurrect Minsk agreements in this or that form? Will Ukraine accept, if not formal independence, then at least de facto independence of these republics, or it is really a deal breaker? And of course, we should keep in mind that not only Vladimir Putin needs a victory, but Volodymyr Zelensky also needs victory. He cannot get out of this conflict as a loser. It is inconceivable to imagine that Ukrainians will accept a defeat. So I think the trick is to find a solution that would allow both sides to claim victory, and that would allow the West to say that it's not an appeasement policy. And this is not easy for sure.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Gerard with some questions that are on the response again from the West and on whether there is transatlantic unity over the approach to Russia, and in particular on issues of energy dependency. And there's also a question on China and China's response to Russian disinformation. I don't know if that's something you want to touch on. I'm sending them all your way.
Thank you. But if you allow me, I will come back to the humanitarian corridors because I have some experience of it. French NGOs, especially Médecins Sans Frontières, and the French, we have been working on this issue for decades. The problem that you are facing for humanitarian corridors usually is the chain of command to the highest level, to basically the head of the platoon. Really how to transmit the orders, how to transmit, really the schedule and so on. And I noticed that the head of the French military intelligence has said, I think a few days ago, that they noticed how much the chain of command, the Russian chain of command, was totally broken. That the communication system, what we call the tactical communication system towards, in a sense, the men in the field, was actually dysfunctional to the point of seeing Russian soldiers using their mobile phone or head of platoons using their mobile phone to transmit information. So I think that when you talk about humanitarian corridors, you have to admit that in any case, it's very complicated to make them work. And in this case, it happens that there are obviously communication problems and organizational problems. That's really, in a sense, the technical aspect, because we have been working in France over these issues for decades, trying to say how to do it, what is the best way to do it. And in a sense, it may work, but it's also always dangerous and very often disappointing. As for the questions, what would be what was the first one?
Well, I mean, we have a question generally. We've had two questions about transatlantic unity, about the approach to deterring Russia, and whether the US and the EU could do more, and whether they agree on the response, particularly over energy issues. I'm summarizing.
I think, really, frankly, the relationship between the Biden administration and Europeans, I think, had been extremely close, and I think extremely positive. Again, you see what does it mean to have a functioning administration, who knows what is diplomacy. Really, there has been the incredible, frankly, farcical and tragic history of the MiG-29, the Polish MiG-29. I still don't understand how the Americans have done it, but it's really a total failure. But beyond this, and which actually may have consequences, but that's another issue. But beyond that, I think the Biden administration has managed the allies with a lot of consistency and sensitivity to their situation. When President Biden has announced the embargo on Russian oil, he has acknowledged that some European countries were in a different situation and could take different decisions, but he has not done it in a sort of accusatory way or derogatory way. No, I think that, frankly, and as you know, the main European leaders have been on the video really in a very intensive way, and also the Secretary of State Tony Blinken has been around in Europe. I should really say that's really it worked pretty well. As for the future, of course, we don't know what will be the reaction. But the Biden administration, it's very funny because in Europe, all the anti-Americans are saying, oh, the Ukrainians are not going to negotiate because the Americans don't want it. My personal conviction and personal analysis is that the Americans want to solve this crisis as quickly as possible. And not only on for humanitarian reasons, but also for political reasons. Really, the Americans don't want to have a crisis, to have a permanent, enduring crisis, where they will be, again, as I was saying, dragged back into European affairs. So I really, I may be wrong, but I don't expect any outbidding coming from Washington, really anti-Russian. This administration is not anti-Russian. When President Biden met President Putin in June, last June in Geneva, the message was not pro-Russian, but it was not either anti-Russian. So I don't, again, there will be bumps. There are always bumps into managing such a crisis. Obviously, the Europeans have, because of their geography, have different interests than the American ones. But so far, I think that the Biden administration has been very careful in managing the Europeans, and we have not seen, but the MiG-29 accident, we have not seen a real disagreements in the alliance. As for China, on one side, the first thing people were saying, oh, it's good for China because Russia will depend on China more and more, and the Americans will be, as I was saying, will be dragged back into a European crisis and won't be able to focus their attention and their means on Asia, really. And at the same time, China is I know that the Americans and a lot of Westerners see China as a sort of moving threat, advancing threat. But don't forget that China is also a conservative power, also in the world order. Really, they depend very much on international trade. They depend very much on globalization, on working globalization, and they have their own territorial problems. Everybody is thinking of Taiwan, but they are thinking of Tibet on their side. And I do remember that when we were discussing the annexation of Crimea at the Security Council, the Chinese were extremely prudent. And as Andrey said, they abstained. But I'm not sure that they are so much actually excited by this unpredictable Russia and by this the prospect of an enduring international crisis, which could have unpredictable consequences on the world economy. Don't forget it, China is very much integrated into the world economy.
So we're already a little over time. I want to ask one last question to each of you. And I'm sorry, I won't have been able to get to all the questions in the Q&A. But thank you all for contributing to the discussion. Olga, I mean, I really just want to ask, what should we be most worried about now? And what should be the focus of what you think, policymakers should be thinking about?
So what I worry about most is escalation. And what I worry about second most is the horrific effects of the war as it continues. So the challenge is to walk from Western perspective, the challenge is to walk the line of providing Ukraine with enough support that it continues to put pressure on Russia such that it convinces Russia that it needs to be at the negotiating table, that it clarifies the sanctions policy to ensure that there is a message sent to Russia that a deal with Ukraine, that is a real deal with Ukraine, will lead to the lifting of sanctions, will lead to easing of the pressure on Russia, will lead to new talks and new arrangements so that there is an incentive to do that. And, in that way, try to foster the odds of an agreement. The job of the Ukrainians is to hold on and to indeed keep the pressure on Russia, and also to be willing to negotiate that deal. I think the Ukrainian government very much is. It's then going to have to go back and sell that to a population that is increasingly traumatized with each day. And in Russia, I think the mission is very much that Russian elites need to somehow get it through to the highest levels of government that a deal with Ukraine and an end to this war is going to serve Russian security best, and that there are ways to do that, and call it a victory, call it whatever, but that there is a way out of this that isn't the collapse of Russia. And I think, none of this is going to be easy. This is a very difficult situation.
Gerard, and then Andrey, I'm going to ask you to come in. Gerard, if you would, and then Andrey for the last thoughts.
1 minute, as I have said, my main, of course, beyond what Olga said, which of course is that going back to what Andrey said, Putin should be able to say that he has not lost, which means that also on the Western side, we shouldn't be on the punishing mode against Russia, which is very difficult. And really, as I've said, we'll accept the idea that the outcome will be a compromise, and which means that there will be elements in this compromise that the West won't like. Really, for instance, if Ukraine is neutralization of Ukraine, there will be elements in this stage. And as I've said in the very beginning of our webinar, I think that we should let Ukrainians to decide, and we should accept what the Ukrainians decide, because they are the suffering side of the conflict.
Andrey, if I may come in for the last word.
I think that there are quick fixes and long-term strategic decisions that have to be made. In terms of quick fixes, I think that whatever is needed to stop the bloodshed is the top priority, because every day people are killed, every day sufferings are multiplied, infrastructure is destroyed, and of course, as Gerard pointed out, there is certain logic in any conflict, and unfortunately, the longer it lasts, the more difficult it is to stop it. So that should be kept in mind. So that would be my top priority. But in terms of long-term strategic decisions, I think that we should all think how to make sure that this is the last big conflict in Europe, that it will never be repeated once again, because we somehow took it for granted that such a thing was not possible in Europe of the 21st century, but here we are. We see a major military conflict, and it means that something really went dramatically wrong with the European security architecture, with all the mechanisms that we worked on for so many years, which we hoped would prevent such a development, but they didn't prevent it. So we should get back to the drawing boards to see what we can do in order to make sure that it will be indeed the last conflict in the European history.
Thank you all. I mean, I certainly, when I was covering this as a journalist in 2014, didn't think we would end up here. And I don't think anybody did imagine it. And it's an incredibly difficult situation. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on what ways we might have to mitigate the bloodshed. So with that, I think we're going to end this discussion, but we'll keep talking. So